This is the lecture for European history for Monday, the 17th of May, 2021. Where we are in the Second World War is the European war has moved as far as Moscow, and with the connivance of a late start and October snows and Siberian troops, Hitler's forces were pushed back from the suburbs of Moscow itself. But with the exception of Britain, Hitler's Germany has conquered everything in Europe that it wants to, west of Russia. Meanwhile, in the east, in Asia, the Japanese have colluded with their German allies to get a hold of French Indochina, which prompted President Franklin Roosevelt and the American Congress to place embargoes on oil and other strategic supplies to the Japanese until or unless they withdraw from French Indochina and, quite frankly, from their invasions of China that have been going on since 1937. The Japanese are given a choice. They can accept the American demands and knuckle under, or they can attack. This is Imperial Japan, who is led by a god emperor, whose junior officers in the army particularly, again and again, push national policy in the direction they want. The civilian government and even the general staff ends up following where the junior officers, these lieutenants and captains, lead. So what will a Japanese army, what will it do? Well, while you're thinking about that, there's one last Churchill quote I want to give you from the Battle of Britain. Never in the field of human endeavor have so many owed so much to so few. Never in the field of human endeavor have so many owed so much to so few. And what that is a reference to is the Battle of Britain and the hundreds of Spitfire pilots and Hurricane pilots whose individual efforts, supported by the ground crews, the radar stations, the command bunkers, and the rest of Britain, kept the Germans from taking control of British airspace and therefore kept the Germans from winning the Battle of Britain. Never in the field of human endeavor have so many, that's the British Empire and the world, owed so much, the survival of freedom, at least in Europe, to so few. And that is to the pilots in particular. So if you ever hear references to the few, that is usually a reference to the RAF fighter pilots of the Battle of Britain. Now, back to the Imperial Japanese. What do you think they're going to do? Are they going to knuckle under to the Americans? No, of course not. So they decide to fight. Now, the leader of the Navy, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, is an officer who, as a younger man, spent time in the United States. As the naval attaché in Washington, he became known as a sharp poker player. And he got a sense for how big the United States is and how much industrial power we had back in those days. We were the factory of the world, the arsenal of democracy. So he didn't want to go to war. But when the government and the emperor goes along with the idea of fighting a war to secure resources and autarky, economic autarky, the result is he's going to try to plan to win. By the way, if the fans are bothering you, feel free to move. I could care less at this point about seating plans or charts. In fact, it's very likely I'm going to be returning my desks to their normal pre-Wu Flu configuration. So if you want, you can sit where you want, just like normal people, normal times, which we seem to be returning to as well. Yamamoto does not think that Japan can wage and win a long war with the United States. He's right. Instead, what he is planning is a series of knockout blows that should allow Japan to run the Pacific for about 6 months, with the hope of capturing enough territory and doing enough damage so as to prove to the Americans that they should make peace on Japanese terms, rather than fight and have to retake dozens of islands and steaming Southeast Asian jungles. What we need to do, Yamamoto hopes the Americans will conclude, is just accept it. Just accept that Japan is now in charge of East Asia, and that the only way to get rid of them is to basically fight a long and nasty and bloody war. So, the naval staff comes up with a plan. The American Pacific Fleet, I'm going to be working behind you ladies, so you may want to move or just be aware that I'm going to be here. Here's Japan. The American Pacific Fleet had been based in San Diego, California, San Francisco. But to discourage Japanese aggression when they go into Indochina, the American Pacific Fleet base is moved to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, on the island of Oahu. Pearl Harbor is a beautiful harbor with a long channel to the ocean, easily blocked. It's also much closer to the Japanese home islands. So, what is going to happen is the Japanese Kido Butai is their carrier strike force, is going to leave Japanese waters in November in secret. They are going to proceed in areas not usually used by shipping to a position north of Oahu, where they will launch an attack intended to sink the American fleet while in harbor. They do this because the British are able to pull this off with the Italian fleet at a place called Taranto. Yeah, not Toronto, Taranto, in a few months earlier. The British adapt torpedoes to operate in shallow harbor waters, and they sink the bulk of the Italian fleet, at least for a while. The Japanese, inspired by this, are going to try to do the same thing at Pearl Harbor. Aircraft carriers are fast ships equipped with launching and landing strips and a hangar where planes can be prepared, armed, and repaired. Battleships had been the primary weapon of striking for navies since well before modern times. Well, since the beginning of modern times, since the Spanish Armada, anyway, in 1588. Ships with heavy guns blasting at one another at range. In World War I, this was still the case with the dreadnoughts and battlecruisers I told you about. Well, like many people, the Americans who run the fleet mostly believe that the battleship is still the most important ship. So at Pearl Harbor is our Pacific Battle Force, consisting of every battleship we have that's not in the Atlantic Ocean. Are we stupid? Do our people not understand that the oil embargo has pushed the Japanese into a corner that they may attack out of? Oh, no, they realize it. In fact, a week before December 7th, the weekend of December 1st, my birthday, the fleet is put on alert and goes to sea because code breakers indicated that the Japanese fleet was at sea. It was, and was about to attack Pearl Harbor. Eventually it would. They were off by a week. The American fleet at Pearl Harbor had a bit of boy crying wolf syndrome, in that since the embargo started, there have been scares regarding terrorists. There was a large Japanese population in Hawaii. The fear that some of them were going to be terrorists and blow up airplanes caused us to put all of our planes in the center of airfields close together. That way it would be hard for terrorists to get at them. And to keep our ships dense packed in dock so that they wouldn't be easy prey to terrorists. And then these war scares where the fleet has to sally forth. Well, one of the nicest things about being in Hawaii is going on leave in Hawaii. So the week, which is going to include Sunday, December 7th, is not a week that war scares are going to be believed. So the fleet is in harbor, and the belief is that the Japanese, if they strike, will strike in the Philippines over in East Asia. Nobody thinks they'll attack the Pacific Fleet in Hawaii. It's crazy talk. Plus, there's radar. Yep, a single radar truck was sent to Hawaii by the American military, courtesy of the British, who helped give us better radar technology. And that radar truck was supposed to go on top of the mountain in the center of Oahu. But the top of the mountain in the center of Oahu is a bird sanctuary. And the bird sanctuary people of the Audubon Society complained that the radar truck would disturb the birdies. So instead, they have to pick a side of the mountain to go on. So they're only going to be able to look in one direction rather than all directions. But that's not all, because that radar truck doesn't have enough fuel or people allocated to it for constant operation. So it's on every 4 hours. 4 hours on, 4 hours off, 4 hours on, 4 hours off. Well, as we are approaching 7 a.m. local time, Sunday, December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor is a sleepy naval town. A lot of the guys, officers and enlisted, are with their ladies ashore. The radar station's about to come off duty when they pick up a large formation of aircraft moving in from the north. They are told by the command center that the Army is planning on moving a bunch of B-17 heavy bombers in. It's probably just them. Don't worry about it. Shut off and come in. They follow orders. They shut off and come in. Those planes were not Army B-17s. At 7 a.m., Japanese aircraft fly over the city of Honolulu and over the naval base at Pearl Harbor, and they start dropping bombs and torpedoes. The American Pacific Fleet is sent to the bottom of Pearl Harbor within 2 hours. Nobody, except a few small ships, even is able to move out of their docks towards the open sea. One ship, luckily, is stopped before it gets into the channel, because had it gotten into the channel and then sunk, her Pearl Harbor would have been blocked up like a wine bottle with a cork in it. So the battleships are destroyed. The Japanese declare victory, and they head out to do mischief elsewhere. Luckily for us, the Japanese do not invade. Had they brought an invasion force with them to Hawaii December 7th, the likelihood is they would have been able to seize the Hawaiian Islands. Luckily, our aircraft carriers, our own aircraft carriers that were in the area, were on their way to an island in the western Pacific called Wake Island, dropping off aircraft. So the USS Enterprise and others were not in port. So the opposite numbers of the Japanese aircraft carriers were not there to be destroyed. And with Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Navy has proven that air power is much more powerful than a battleship. A battleship can shoot a Volkswagen-sized shell out over the horizon to maybe 30 miles. An aircraft carrier can send fighters and bombers out 500, 800, 1,000, 1,200 miles, depending upon the planes and the armament. and can send wave after wave and do more damage. So the American aircraft carriers are not in port, the harbor is not blocked up, and the Japanese neglect to destroy the oil storage facilities near the base. Had they destroyed the oil storage facilities, the fleet would have had to rebase in California because you need a stock of oil in order to have a naval base. That's one of the reasons ships go in to refuel. That's why you have a naval base. Had the Japanese hit the oil, it would have been gone. In any event, with the exception of the carriers and the oil, the American fleet is destroyed, and the American fleet's going to be on the defensive for a while. Japan's Kido Butai, its carrier force, then go on a series of conquests, along with the rest of their military. For example, Japanese already in China take Shanghai's foreign areas, takes Hong Kong. The army in Southeast Asia moves into Thailand and Burma towards British India. And they reach British India very quickly. The British have a major base at Singapore. The Japanese land troops north of Singapore and with bicycles transit this, what the British think is impassable jungle. Attacking Singapore from the land, something the British never anticipated, all the British guns faced the sea. The British had put 500,000 men in what they called Fortress Singapore, which had to surrender because the Japanese destroyed the oil, the water treatment plants that gave fresh water to the city and to the garrison. 500,000 British soldiers surrendered to about 50,000 Japanese. Actually, I think 30,000. Think about that. 500,000 soldiers surrendered to 30,000, 35,000 soldiers. So Singapore is gone. And the Japanese land in the Dutch East Indies to take the oil, and they land in the Philippines and drive our people into a defensive position called the Bataan Peninsula and the island of Corregidor. So the Japanese are advancing towards India, advancing through Singapore, towards the Dutch East Indies, towards Australia, through the Philippines. No one is able to stop them. The Japanese even raid as far as Colombo, Ceylon, what's now Sri Lanka, and into the Indian Ocean. No one seems to be able to stop these guys. From being a joke, the Japanese army suddenly is populated by supermen who can live off of a cup of rice a day and fight their way through jungle that no white man could even live in. The American fleet can do nothing. The British can do nothing. In fact, the loss of Singapore makes Britain a joke in Asia because they had talked up how Singapore was tough up until this point, and then they fold. On Bataan, this little thumb of land near the city of Manila, the Americans plan to hold out until relieved by a fleet sent from the United States. This army includes Americans and Filipinos. As time goes on, week after week, they're on shorter and shorter rations. Still, they are the only people in the Pacific to actually stop the Japanese from having a quick and easy conquest. But after a while, the Filipinos and the Americans on the Philippines, on Bataan, begin to suspect that nobody's coming to their rescue. And they begin to call themselves the Battling Bastards. And their refrain, their poem is, "We are the battling bastards of Bataan. No mama, no papa, no Uncle Sam." In other words, they're on their own. They fight and hold from December 1941 until March, April 1942. President Roosevelt orders the commander of these troops, General Douglas MacArthur, the most decorated officer in the American Army during World War I, who had been the chief of staff of the U.S. Army at the time of the Great Depression, who had been the commander and field marshal of the Philippine Armed Forces, very famous individual. He ordered MacArthur to leave his troops, go to Australia, and organize a counterattack. MacArthur refused to go. The President of the United States made it a personal order. You cannot refuse a presidential order like that. The President wanted MacArthur to sneak out of the Philippines on a submarine because it was safer. MacArthur took his wife and young son, he had a boy 6, 7 years old, onto motor torpedo boats, little surface craft made of plywood armed with torpedoes. And on those torpedo boats, spent days passing from Bataan through the central into the southern Philippines, where he finally got a flight to Australia. He did this to share some of the risk his men would face. But the truth is, he was ordered out and they were left. When they ran out of food, water, and ammunition, and that's the key, ammunition, the battling bastards of Bataan finally surrendered to a Japanese army that didn't even have the wherewithal to feed itself, to a Japanese army filled with rage and who believed that anyone who surrendered was less than a human being. There are more defenders in the Bataan Peninsula than there are Japanese attackers. So a Japanese commander, without the knowledge of the Japanese general in charge of the Philippines, decides he's going to solve the problem of too many prisoners with what becomes known to history as the Bataan Death March. In tropical heat, for 3 days and 3 nights, the tens of thousands of surviving Americans and Filipinos are marched northward to captivity in the jungles north of Bataan. Anyone who slows down is bayoneted. Anyone who stops is clubbed to death. A significant proportion of the prisoners that were taken alive at the surrender of Bataan are killed on their way north in a 3-day death march. The Bataan Death March is one of the many war crimes the Japanese are known for. It was an act of intentional cruelty designed to break the will of the survivors and turn them into docile, easily kept captives. The same thing is done to the British who surrender at Singapore. And then those British are used as slave labor, building a railroad through the jungle for the Japanese to attack India. By the end of the Axis advances into 1942, the Germans have reached as far as central Russia. They've taken a good portion of South Russia. They are in North Africa trying to drive at Egypt. And in the Pacific, the Japanese are everywhere. If you look back there, between eastern India and the Bay of Bengal, that's the area to the right of the Indian Peninsula, all the way to those dark blotches that I've added for the key battles. They control the Western Pacific and everything north of Australia. 1942 is the year of turning point. The first and most important turning point battle of the war, fulcrum, around which the war turns, is the Battle of the Atlantic. In the Battle of the Atlantic, the Germans once again are going to try to starve the British into surrender. What they're going to do is use their surface ships and later their submarines to sink as many ships bringing supplies of all kinds to Britain as they possibly can. In doing so, they hope to induce starvation because the British don't have enough land to feed themselves, and a starving people cannot fight. They will surrender, and Germany will win the war. Winston Churchill once said that the only battle, the only thing that kept him up at night with worry was the Battle of the Atlantic. The fear that the Germans would actually succeed in sinking so many ships, so much shipping, that there is no way in heck that Britain can keep fighting. This battle goes on from the first day of World War II in 1939, September 3rd, first day Britain's involved, when the cruise ship Athenia is sunk by a German submarine, up to the end of the war in Europe. The height of the battle is in 1940, when Britain is standing alone, into 1941, and then 1941 to 1942, when the Americans get involved, but we have no discipline. We don't appreciate how dangerous the submarines can be. Where I used to live in Portland, Maine, they spotted the conning towers of German submarines. They frequently saw the explosions of ships just offshore. The Germans came right up to our shores and sank ships. And at first, the Americans, we did not realize that we have to shut our lights off at night. Because what you do when you leave your lights on in cities and towns with headlights is you backlight any ship off your coast. You also help the enemy navigate. So one of the things that was necessary during World War II, and this caused a lot of accidents, a lot of death, was nobody was allowed to show light after dark. You'd have blackout curtains taped to your windows so nothing, not even a chink of light, could escape. And headlights had these dimmer things put onto their outer bulbs, so there was only this little thin slit of reduced light that might allow you to see the road on a good night. In this Battle of the North Atlantic, it was a race of technology. The Germans had submarines, so the British developed sonar. Sonar is like radar, but with sound. A pulse is sent out, boom, hits the Cudmore, the SS Cudmore, boop, and that boop comes back, and I receive it, and by calculating where the boop comes back from, I can tell where he is, how far away he is, and I can move into target. The Germans then decide they're going to operate on the surface and attack after dark in swarms called wolf packs. The British have real difficulty with these wolf packs. What they really need is air power. The problem is there aren't enough aircraft to cover the entire passage of ships from New York and Nova Scotia all the way to the British Isles. And in that gap, the U-boats sink a lot of ships. To give you a picture of what this is like, lights please. You at home, I expect there'll be a second part to this video.